There are some people who like to argue that all conservative art is bad because they're unimaginative or uncreative, unable to make a truly great work of art because of their politics. They almost seem to relish the idea. It's a commonly used joke online anytime a piece of kitsch MAGA art or cringy right-wing comedy special enters the zeitgeist. Sometimes it's a too serious and overly generalized argument used to explain why conservatism itself is bad. I personally would use other examples to show why conservatism is, quote, a cult of deception that exclusively deals in lies, particularly in the year of our Lord 2025, because it's not like there's a shortage of them. People have gone on entire Twitter threads discussing conservatives' lack of empathy as a reason for their bad art, and that they see art as mere in-group signaling, and go on about the metaphysically vague notion that conservatives are all death-oriented and that art is life-oriented, whatever that means. Reasoning that sounds like it came from someone who religiously attends Burning Man and exclusively watches Jubilee videos titled "Leftist Obliterates Dirt-Eating Conservative." But many conservative artists have created technically masterful, unique works that have been positively reviewed and referenced in other artistic works. So, can we really say all conservatives are bad at art simply because of their politics? If we're going to argue that all conservative art is bad, we'd have to accept that leftist art is always good or even transcendental by comparison, which it clearly isn't.
Before I go any further, I just want to give a little disclaimer. I've been writing this script for the last few weeks, and in that time, current events have gotten intense. And since I'm talking about conservative art, it's inevitable that I talk about conservative politics. There are probably going to be people who click on this video who think this will align with their conservative beliefs, because I've probably titled it something like "Conservative Art Isn't All Bad." There will probably also be some people who click on this expecting it to be some kind of ironic takedown or rage bait who already have a snarky comment locked and loaded. This genuinely started as a good faith effort to examine what people mean when they say all conservative art is bad, whether that's always true, and what kinds of assumptions we're making, and what role politics plays in shaping both the art and its reception. But as this administration slides further into authoritarianism by rounding up marginalized people and exerting a campaign of terror on American cities, it's gotten harder to keep that tone of neutrality. It's just as much about the ideology as it is the art, and it feels dishonest not to acknowledge the lack of empathy and logical coherence of conservatism as a political framework, and how it shows up in the art made within or in service of it. The stories that move people are almost always about resistance, about standing up to tyranny, about learning to trust, to empathize, to protect people who are different from you or disenfranchised. They're rooted in leftist values. You don't need to call it that for it to be true, but conservative ideology tries to frame the values of dignity, justice, and equity as radical or dangerous when they're often the foundation of what makes art resonate in the first place. So this is still a video about conservative art, but it's also a video about why so much of the art we call good tends to reflect a worldview that runs counter to conservative politics and supports leftist ideology. Especially as history is repeating itself and life is imitating art in real time right outside.
One could argue all art is political, but politics don't always determine its quality. So what does? Is it poor execution and lack of technical know-how, or is it the underlying messaging or emotional response we have to it? Must it be novel and truly one of a kind, prolific in nature, have historically significant provenance, a confluence of everything? To me, you can put conservative art into roughly 4 categories. As you can see here, the most extreme example is borderline surrealist propaganda that is simply an appeal to authority. It doesn't challenge the viewer or consumer and functions merely as an apotheosis of a ruling oppressor. This kind of art is sometimes nearly indistinguishable from AI-generated slop like Trump touring Gaza remodeled into a Palm Beach resort town. The second second kind of conservative art is not as overt in its delusion of a conservative utopia and is perhaps more competent or at least intellectual on some level, or just feels conservative. Quaint cottages bathed in god rays that are still garish in their use of color, but not a fever dream of anti-woke garbage simply made to piss off the libs. Stuff that tries to make a logical case for conservative values or would be acceptable to hang on the walls of a youth group teen center or above the toilet in your grandparents' home. While these two categories are clearly influenced by conservative values and could be strictly considered conservative art, the third category is art made by a conservative that sometimes explores ideas beyond politics alone. It's not making a case for conservative ideology so blatantly, but is still influenced by it in some way nonetheless. It's not an affront to the senses and is sometimes quite interesting and in some way influential. Character studies and narrative-driven works that are more restrained and offer some amount of personal reflection. A lot of this kind of art has a wider appeal because it's not preachy on the surface, and if audiences are aware of the creator's politics, we've kind of separated the art from the artist. The final category isn't even conservative art or art made by a conservative, but art that is completely misinterpreted by conservative audiences who have taken the wrong lesson away from what it's trying to say. It's appropriation, where the worst people on the planet refuse or were unable to engage with it subtextually and have turned it into a confused bumper sticker. This kind of turns into a cycle where the appropriated works are then reimagined into conservative rumination. Now, there's a lot of overlap in my made-up, not at all scientific classification, and many of these artists float around or have evolved over time, for better or worse. Like, I'm not sure where I'd put someone like George W. When looking at this kind of art, it's worth asking whether we're conflating personal ideology with artistic incapacity. The idea that someone's worldview makes them fundamentally incapable of creating something meaningful or beautiful veers into assuming that fixed, unchangeable traits define entire groups of people, in this case that conservatives can't make good art. The people who sincerely believe this reduce individuals to caricatures who ironically end up participating in the same kind of culture war logic of the right that they're admonishing. It's a lot like saying women aren't funny or Asian people are all bad drivers. Generalizations like this also erase examples that don't fit the narrative that all conservative art is bad. It's not that conservative thought renders someone artistically inert, it's that certain forms of rigid ideology can close people off from asking more interesting questions. And art, at its best, asks these questions. To be fair, conservatives do often ask boring questions or nothing at all of their art and tend to misinterpret the questions good art does ask, creating a completely incoherent representation of said art. To be clear, this isn't a defense of conservative thought or even most conservative art. I mean, most art that does exist on planet Earth is bad, regardless of political influence. It's just that even if I don't agree with the message of a conservative piece of art, I can at least respect its other aspects as being proficient. I'm simply suggesting that a lot of criticisms of conservative art can also be applied to leftist or liberal art. This, for example, sucks. It's derivative douchebag art that's a clear ripoff of Mr. Brainwash and Basquiat that takes itself way too seriously. While Adrian Brody is at best a liberal, he's not a conservative. He's been vocal about inequality and repressive social issues, and to me, this is liberal art that's just as bad as conservative art. But what are we defining as conservative art? Is it art that has a clear political message, or just any art created by someone of the conservative persuasion? I honestly don't know, because the accusation gets thrown around so loosely that some people seem to label any art made by a conservative as conservative art. Take Georgie Boy's portraits, for example. They don't feel political in nature, but does being such an influential conservative voice and war criminal make them political? I think this is one of the bigger issues with the sentiment that conservative art is all bad. It doesn't differentiate between any of it. This is probably partly because conservatives are an easy target for the left, who more often than not, especially now, so blatantly act as a repressive and authoritarian movement human. So who gives a shit about nuance when criticizing their creative endeavors? Fuck these people. At this point, the phrase is shorthand for a more nuanced conversation, but that shorthand has worn out its welcome in recent years. I've said as much myself in the past to make a point, but the more often I see it flung around as a slam dunk, the less funny and creative it has become, effectively making the person repeating it just as uncreative and unimaginative as the people they're dunking on. And I have tried to update my adjective use when critiquing conservative art, instead describing it as boring or dumb, because I do not think they aren't creative. They might lack critical thinking skills and act out of pure spite sometimes, but conservatives can be very creative, too much so sometimes. But this doesn't mean that all creativity is interesting or necessary or all that unique. Just look at decorating sense for countless examples of tasteless, incompetent creativity.
Then we decoupaged sacred Indian prayers dipped in tea and torn to give an aged look onto the wall unit to give an old piece of furniture a trendy, new look.
But are those prerequisites of good or even middling art? Does all art have to be interesting or necessary or unique in order to exist or be considered good? Norman Rockwell painted scenes of traditional American values. Wholesome, bucolic, patriotic, white. Was he a drooling conservative though? No. He was a self-described moderate Republican who, by the 60s, left the Saturday Evening Post, which championed a retrogressive view of America and began producing work with an explicit social commentary. His most famous being The Problem We All Live With, depicting Ruby Bridges' integration. A conservative might remember Rockwell's nicer, less challenging paintings, upholding them as a prime example of good conservative art, but this misrepresentation ignores context and, more importantly, Rockwell's later work. Yes, early Rockwell depicted idyllic scenes of mid-century Americana, but to reduce him to a conservative mascot is to miss how observational and even critical his paintings could be. Rockwell wasn't signaling to a conservative in-group, but his paintings have in some cases been co-opted by a right-wing fantasy. Which is a lot like taking a still image of a politician waving to a crowd to try and prove Elon wasn't actually Sieg Heiling, or that Cory Booker is also a secret Nazi. So then wouldn't Elon also be a Nazi? Not sure what point is trying to be proven here. That's not to say a lot of conservatives don't see art as only a tool for political in-group signaling, especially fervent ultra-nationalists, but they usually retrofit existing cultural icons for ideological purposes. Trump wraps himself in the visual language of populism while pushing oligarchic policies and blasting Springsteen at rallies despite his explicitly anti-authoritarian politics. Where in-group signaling is very strong is in someone like John McNaughton. He uses the composed, high-contrast lighting of classical realism while stripping away all ambiguity and reflection. Where Rockwell thoughtfully showed America as it was, or could be, who had a unique eye for composition, McNaughton composes flat, formulaic scenes of an America under siege by blue-haired activists. This isn't just bad conservative art, it's just bad art. It's not even about beauty, which is odd, as many conservatives feel that art should be visually appealing and nothing else. Nor is it all that complex, as the symbolism isn't very subtle. It's a man who loves America so much that he's in a constant state of mourning for a bygone past and terrified for its imagined ongoing downfall. If the country is in degeneracy, it's not from the people he's pointing the finger at. And McNaughton isn't really comparable to Rockwell anyway. He's closer to Thomas Kincaid if Kincaid was foaming red, white, and blue from the mouth and had a humiliating crush on Donald Trump. The self-declared painter of light made Christian fusion art that sanitized nostalgia and sentimental Americana into a billion-dollar empire, but it was still more subtle than Trump crossing the Delaware. Both artists paint conservative values in a similar style, but with different imagery. At least Kincaid's paintings didn't feel like rage bait, where most of them are inoffensive cottages and lighthouses and cottages and small towns and cottages. Where they are similar is how each artist mass-produced their work.
Kincaid was famous for having studio assistants hand-finish the reproduction prints to create the illusion of authenticity. Motherfucker was treating art like you would a car on an assembly line. He was the Henry Ford of conservative art. McNaughton, too, sells glossy giclée prints of his paintings on his website, some for hundreds of dollars, alongside countless other collectible keepsakes. You can barely consider this stuff art at all. It's merch.
This treatment of art is an important part of what makes this brand of conservative art so hollow that simultaneously sets the bar for what we think all conservative art is: rampant commercialization of belief. These works function less as expressions of faith or patriotism, which on their own are not inherently bad, and more as aesthetic affirmations of tribal loyalty, like a MAGA commemorative coin.
This beautiful limited edition coin commemorates our movement, our fight for freedom, prosperity, and putting America first. We always put America first.
Supporters hang them up in their double wide not because they challenge or inspire, but because they signal membership. A Kincaid or McNaughton print serves the same purpose as a "Don't Tread on Me" flag or an ichthys welded to the back of an F-150. It's proof of how God-fearing and patriotic you are, and that you're willing to finance that belief through Klarna. Much of what is thought to be our common culture is the selective transmission of class-dominated values. What gets mass-produced and distributed is mostly benign decoration, part of a hegemonic system designed to reinforce the status quo rather than question it. Culture under capitalism isn't neutral. It's shaped by institutions that reflect and protect dominant class interests, often under the guise of tradition or morality, depicted in art fit for the middle America junk-covered walls of a Cracker Barrel. The commercialization of art is classic conservatism in its most cynical form that prioritizes personal profit over public good, as in culturally beneficial, selling nostalgia back to the working class while doing nothing to spark a sense of class consciousness that might lead to improved material conditions. The irony is that the very people crushed under the weight of late-stage capitalism are being sold a delusional version of the past and future by men who made millions packaging it and slapping it on a plastic lunchbox.
And now you're selling it. You want to sell it.
The only way Kincaid and McNaughton reflect conservative values is by the way they exploit suckers and sycophants for their personal gain. Their work is predatory, and like most things churned out of conservative culture, it's ultimately about the bottom line. Far removed from the bombast of John McNaughton or MAGA kitsch, there are conservative artists who make good work in spite of their beliefs, not because of them. And then there are artists like Andrew Wyeth and Alex Colville, whose conservatism informs the tone and framing of their work, but doesn't overpower it.
Wyeth painted the American countryside, complete with barns, trees, hills, and all, rendered in tempera, a notoriously unforgiving medium that also gives everything a certain piss-soaked quality to it. That alone is typically enough to turn most people off of his work. But do you want this or this? Fucking pick one. His best-known work, Christina's World, has often been dismissed by critics as being sentimental or crude nostalgia, a romanticized portrait of a woman in a field just out of reach of a wholesome American rural life. The Guardian once called him retrogressive, short-sighted, and strangely empty, likening his aesthetic to that of CPAC boardrooms and bankrupt financial institutions. But that critique, like much of the discourse around conservative art, is a reductive misinterpretation of Wyeth's work, and where I personally disagree with the sentiment that conservative art is always just in-group signaling. Christina's World isn't a portrait of idealized rural virtue. God, I wrote a real rural juror line there. Rural virtue. Sure, you could force that reading of it, but it's actually a depiction of a real disabled woman named Christina who Wyeth had painted before, who had to drag herself through the grass because she had no use of her legs. Pretty fucking ableist, The Guardian. Wyeth wasn't painting nostalgia, but isolation and human frailty. The muted tones and odd perspectives are purposefully disorienting that only a rube would define as quaint. Wyeth, who did vote for Nixon and preferred country life to urban modernity,
modernity, was painting what he saw. A world shaped by physical and mental constraint and the emotional silence of small-town strangeness. This isn't propaganda. If anything, it's just a refusal to be sentimental, but critics talked about him like he was making blood and soil posters. Another example is Alex Colville, a Canadian artist and longtime card-carrying member of the Progressive Conservative Party. Like Waithe, Colville rejected the abstract modernism of his contemporaries, sticking instead to a stylized realism of subdued color palettes, geometric framing reminiscent of PS2 graphics, and precise control over his medium of choice. His paintings also depict everyday life, but through cold and often disquieting compositions. Critics called his work emotionally distant and formally static, noting its indifference to the progressive currents of the post-war art world. Probably the only conservative thing about his art, but not necessarily a bad thing. Does it fill you with joy and exuberance? Not particularly, but neither does an H.R. Giger or Beksinski painting, and the purpose of art isn't to only comfort and engender happy thoughts. It should be challenging and sorrowful and hostile as well. His paintings have a kind of quiet dread, like something terrible just happened or is about to, that I personally find quite engaging. There's no ideology bashing you over the head telling you what you should feel, and there are many ways to interpret his body of work, from themes of alienation and isolation to loss of faith in people and institutions. What I find even more fascinating about Colville is that his art has been used as inspiration for other more progressive artists. Directors such as Wes Anderson, Michael Mann, and the Coen brothers have used various Colville paintings in their own compositions, either explicitly or implicitly. In a similar way, Wythe's painting, Christina's World, has been incorporated into many other works of art as well. There are parallels to it in Forrest Gump and The Last of Us Part 2. It makes an appearance in the 2013 movie Oblivion, and it's mentioned in the novelization of 2001: A Space Odyssey as being one of the two paintings in the living room in which David is transported to after passing through the Stargate. If these were truly bad or shallow works of art, they wouldn't be studied, referenced, or reimagined by artists with an entirely different worldview. Influence isn't proof of quality, but when progressive or avant-garde or left-leaning creators continuously draw from the visual language of the likes of Wythe and Colville, it suggests something more universal, emotionally complex, and artistically compelling is going on than political alignment alone. What makes artists like Wythe and Colville useful to this conversation isn't just that they were conservative, but that their conservatism didn't lead to cringe propaganda. They might not have been as demented as McNaughton, but their work resists the kind of easy didactic messaging we often associate with bad ideological art. They weren't trying to teach a moral or win a culture war. They were showing a world that felt real to them, even if that world was emotionally remote or quiet. Did they feel that way about the world because of their beliefs, and did those beliefs influence their work? Probably, but that also means that an artist can progress through the creative process as well, not just stagnate in it. And these are by no means bad, which is maybe what makes their work so frustrating for some critics. It doesn't try to make you feel good about your beliefs.
Most of the time when the joke about how all conservative art is bad gets tossed around, people are speaking in generalities, which doesn't necessarily disprove the claim, but it does lack some self-reflection of the kind of art liberals or leftists make. Typically, they're referring to extreme examples, something gaudy and also God-y. A painting of Donald Trump as a religious savior in the Oval Office with the angels, liberty, truth, and justice watching over him. Or an absolutely deranged painting of Kamala Harris devouring a bald eagle set against a mushroom cloud. Or perhaps a revisionist film that glorifies not only war and American imperialism, but a man who called Iraqis savages and is quoted as saying he had fun killing the bad guys in his memoir, who talks like a serial killer taking advantage of a system that rewards dehumanization in the name of democracy. These are the kinds of conservative art that most people refer to when they say conservative art is bad. But not all art created by conservatives is so catechistic or pro-manifest destiny. Even the most reactionary movements have shaped culture through art. Just look at the aesthetic legacy of fascist architecture or hyper-masculine chauvinist pulp fantasy. I don't care what anyone says, Frank Frazetta fucking rules though.
Speaking of movies, Clint Eastwood is another example worth taking a look at. An artist who complicates the narrative that conservative creators can't make truly great works of art. In a system that largely leans liberal, Eastwood is a well-known conservative who has directed some of the most critically acclaimed character studies in American cinema. Films like Mystic River and $1 Million Baby, and even Gran Torino to an extent, are less ideological manifestos than meditations on guilt, justice, aging, and emotional repression. I mean, the underlying message in Gran Torino is very pro-assimilation as a means to make it in America, but it's no American Sniper. And despite some of the messaging of his more politically opinionated films, I don't feel like any of his films pander to a specific base. Even in American Sniper, there are still subtle criticisms of the institutions that cause PTSD in those it claims to care so much about. He doesn't strike me as someone who proselytizes or grandstands in the name of idolization. Except that one time he talked to an empty chair at the RNC. That was kind of weird.
What? What do you want me to tell Romney? I can't tell him to do that. Can't do that to himself. You're crazy. You're absolutely crazy.
He's just an old man who tells stories, who just so happens to be conservative, but is at least able to do some self-reflection. That's not to say he's free from critique. I've already mentioned how American Sniper is, to put it mildly, a polarizing work of jingoistic revisionism when viewed through a critical lens that's stripped of nuance, especially when you know how much of Chris Kyle's autobiography was either embellished or outright fabricated. For anyone who doesn't know, he claimed that he got in a fistfight with Jesse Ventura, stopped multiple carjackings, and shot looters during Hurricane Katrina that were all unsubstantiated and bizarre flexes. The problem with the film is that it glosses over these exaggerations that are an intrinsic part of Kyle as a person, smoothing out his rougher edges in order to build a more palatable myth out of the man while having the boring thesis of, war sure as hell, huh guys? The film also does little to question or even contextualize any of that for any of its other characters. The result is a film that lionizes its subject and turns everyone around him into a stereotype of hero, victim, or target. By sort of stripping away a lot of details of Chris Kyle's views, he becomes less the man he was and less the man he was trained to be, and less the man the American government and populace asked him to be. And so the movie isn't willing to make the case for Chris Kyle as he was. Eastwood doesn't deal exclusively in revisionist myth-making like American Sniper, though. His filmography is full of ideological waffling that might venerate an institution in one film and then pick it apart in the next. He vacillates between reverent portrayals of traditional values and more humanist explorations of individuals caught in systems that fail them. Juror number 2 leans towards the latter and doesn't romanticize the justice system when its main theme is questioning whether it can produce justice at all, where the characters aren't redeemed by those institutions but ground down by them. This is what separates him from other conservative adjacent artists who might be afraid of contradiction or pushback. In a lot of ways, Gran Torino sits at the intersection of these two Eastwoods, the one who clings to myth and the one who deconstructs it. He plays a get-off-my-lawn racist who eventually learns to love his immigrant neighbors, but the change is limited and conditional and only ever comes about after instilling in them that in order to be American, they should essentially be normal. While it doesn't evolve into a progressive icon, he dies by sacrificing himself in an all too convenient way, still trying to preserve a version of American honor that only ever existed in his head. It wraps up the story in a too tidy way, where he leaves his house to the church and gives his car to the boy he'd mentored, as long as he doesn't modify it. A subtle conservative metaphor for keeping things the way they are. Eastwood feels like a relic whose messages are often muddled and out of step with modern sensibilities. But more to my point about bad conservative art, Eastwood knows how to make a fucking movie. Unforgiven is a masterpiece, as is Mystic River. Even if his filmography was exclusively about how awesome capitalism or libertarianism is, they'd still at least look great. He has decades of experience and is clearly a cinephile himself, so no one can say, even if you disagree with his films, that they all look like shit or that he doesn't know what he's doing. He's not making movies that look like God's Not Dead.
Like it's something that God wants me to do. I can't just turn away from it.
You just want to ensnare them in your primitive superstition.
What I want is for them to make their own choice. That's what God wants.
You have no idea how much I'm going to enjoy failing you.
Yeah, but who are you really looking to fail? Me or God?
And to be fair, even the most progressive or liberal Hollywood filmmakers aren't immune to making bad or confused art either. If Eastwood is the example of a conservative director whose work can still be character-driven and reflective, then the opposite case might be someone like Alex Garland. Garland has made films that flirt with progressive ideas in things like Ex Machina and Men, but his recent works feel like the liberal version of the same war is hell apologist propaganda. Civil War is visually good but politically cartoonish, a movie about a divided America that's too afraid to say anything about how it got that way. And his most recent film, Warfare, are you sensing a theme? Feels like a huge misstep that tries to reckon with the fallout of Western imperialism and instead is a bizarre army recruiting snuff film. The enemy is vague, the politics are hazy, and the emotional core is, bizarrely, American guilt that ends with soldiers leaving their wake of destruction behind as locals wander around in the rubble with a kind of aimless confusion about what just happened. It's patriotic self-pity masquerading as prestige cinema that I think is meant to have audiences consider the trauma of war, but only from the vantage point of the people who caused it and not, the victims of its collateral damage.
How many times do we need to make this same fucking movie?
This, too, is a form of in-group signaling, but for liberals who attend Cannes and make movies about how we feel bad about what happened without implicating the systems of power that enabled it. Garland seems interested in a real-time battlefield pity party that's more concerned with making the audience feel bad for the people who commit war crimes and how they're coping with killing a bunch of brown people. At least the right has fun and makes their guy a badass sword-wielding messiah that they can rally behind. This is sniveling liberal hogwash. The thing about Garland is he's also a master of his craft in terms of composition. He knows where to put the camera, how to create tension, and keep things moving. But he's making movies that appeal more and more to military-industrial complex simps. On the opposite end, there's Don't Look Up, a very obviously progressive film with a clear, well-intentioned message that's borderline unwatchable. Visually, it's chaotic and kinda nauseating. The politics, though, are clearer, maybe a little too clear.
Our guests today have made a pretty big discovery in space.
How big is this thing, though? Can it destroy my ex-wife's house? Is that possible?
There's a 100% chance that we're all going to die!
Hey.
But the delivery is smug, self-satisfied, and desperate to be liked by people who already agree with it. Or take Todd Phillips' Joker. Not only is it just as derivative as some art made by conservatives, it looks like a movie with a message as muddled as Gran Torino or Warfare, but one that was so misinterpreted by incels and Manosphere Alpha Bros that it was appropriated for the wrong reasons. They interpreted Joaquin Phoenix's Joker to have more in common with Patrick Bateman's Sigma finance bro than as a byproduct of a failed capitalist system who never stopped feeling sorry for himself that was meant to be a parody of the same people who ended up revering him. So no, bad art isn't the exclusive domain of conservatives.
A child's drawing of their family stuck to the fridge with a memorabilia magnet is not technically proficient or even anatomically correct. But this crude doodle is a keepsake for their parents and a memory for a child who will later grow. A painting of Donald Trump in an American flag monster truck fulfills a similar role and is technically better than some scribbles that vaguely resemble a nuclear family. Kids can't even color inside the lines, but that's not what makes it meaningful. Its representation as a milestone of a growing creative mind is what makes it special. A full-grown man who pays taxes and has a mortgage has used his years of training and experience to paint Trump in a monster truck that isn't so different from what a toddler thinks is cool. "I like monster trucks," he says as he eats the same crayons he puts to paper. My point is, a John McNaughton painting is creative and decently executed, even if its meaning might be at best elementary and at worst dull, right-wing propaganda without subtlety or subtext. At least 37,000 people find it to be good, which is more than some shit toddler and their magic marker portrait. And isn't that what art is all about? The validation of faceless strangers on the internet?
There is something to be said about how conservatism does dictate how flexible conservative artists can be, and that thoughtful, inspiring creativity requires an individual to expand their horizons beyond what conservative thought allows. This can create a large portion of people who are unable to see beyond their beliefs to create good art, because the arts are often about questioning those beliefs or looking inward. Conservative ideology is literally about maintaining the status quo and keeping things the way they are, or reverting back to a simpler time that never existed in the first place. In art, this means not experimenting with form or technique. It means playing it safe, doing what you know, and stubbornly refusing to change, or worse, co-opting and appropriating other art. Even still, art being subjective means that all art is technically good to someone and bad to someone else. In a way, it's necessary for bad or even boring art to exist. A 2024 study published in the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology surveyed 7,000 people across 28 countries and found a small but statistically significant correlation between conservative beliefs and lower scores on a culturally neutral creativity test. The authors argue that the conservative tendency to favor order, predictability, and tradition may inhibit the flexibility and openness often required for creative thinking. However, the study also showed that individual traits far outweigh ideology or nationality in predicting creativity. In other words, conservatism might suppress creativity, but it doesn't erase the capacity for it. It just makes it harder to act on without internal resistance. That resistance or hesitance might just be cultural, as Richard Evans, no, not that Richard Evans, puts in his Medium article. Conservatives desperately want what real artists have, but can't quite reach it. Not because they lack imagination, but because they've been taught to fear what that imagination might reveal, or worse, how it might be perceived. In conservative circles, artistic risk often comes at the cost of social belonging and getting called gay by a family member at Thanksgiving. If you write a song that questions authority or paint something that humanizes an outsider, you risk being seen as disloyal to the tribe. So instead of exploring, conservative art often doubles down on symbolism that's already familiar. Flags, Jesus, eagles, guns, even a snow-covered barn, like it's trying to prove something to itself. It insists upon itself. There's creativity there, but it's buried under the fear of saying the wrong thing to the wrong crowd. What results is a kind of pick-me artistic paralysis, where the art exists less to say something and more to be accepted by someone. That desperate need for validation shows up not just in what gets made, but in what gets co-opted as well. The most glaring examples are in music, which I can't play any of it because I'll get a copyright strike on YouTube. Reagan using Springsteen's Born in the USA, and Sarah Palin blasting Tom Petty at rallies until she got hit with a cease and desist. Conservatives borrow the aesthetics of cultural rebellion without understanding the critique within, because actual rebellion requires questioning power, and that's a non-starter for an ideology rooted in preserving hierarchy. How many times do we need to see conservatives just now learning what the machine was that Rage Against the Machine was raging against? It's its own meme. This is where separating the art from the artist is important and complicated. A lot of conservatives engage with art in a purely superficial way based on vibes alone. They end up separating the artist's meaning from the artistic symbolism and misrepresent it to push their own agenda. In film, for whatever reason, this happens to Martin Scorsese all the goddamn time. Taxi Driver, Gangs of New York, The Wolf of Wall Street are all films that are extremely critical of their protagonists, that have been absorbed by reactionary audiences who see Travis Bickle, Bill the Butcher, and Jordan Belfort as aspirational heroes. Not anti-heroes, mind you. They're so caught up in the style and mood and bravado that they can't see the forest for the trees. Scorsese isn't a conservative, and yet his work constantly gets repurposed as symbols of conservative values because they don't engage with it honestly, because intellectualism is gay.
The same thing happened with The Punisher. a character born out of distrust of corrupt institutions who's now the mascot for Blue Lives Matter and had to be updated by the creators in order to distance itself from a bunch of stolen valor propaganda cosplayers. Frank Castle fucking hates cops. He's like the ACAB poster boy, but his skull symbol got turned into a meme of authoritarian bootlickers because they can't read. Oh, between the lines. The distortion often has more to do with the audience's ideology than the artist's intent. They don't want to confront the subtext, they want something cool that tells them what they already believe, bending even the most satirical work that is making fun of them to their will.
This reappropriation speaks to how many of them are discouraged from wielding their creativity freely. They're told what to feel nostalgic for, what to fear, and what to avoid saying if they want to keep their seat at the Norman Rockwell Thanksgiving dinner table. That doesn't mean their art can't be sincere or creative or that it always fails. Clint Eastwood has 5 Oscars he'd like to show you. It just means that progressive or liberal artists are often expected to push forward, where conservative ones are often expected to look back. Dennis Quaid has a Ronald Reagan biopic he'd like to show you where he glazes him for an hour and a half.
What would you say is the issue of our time?
No question about it. Communism and the Soviet Union.
That expectation turns what could be personal or strange or complex into something safe, and more often than not, boring. I think I've been pretty fair regarding conservative creativity. Maybe not so much their art, but they are creative. Some is good, and some is just as bad as left-wing art. But this is exactly the kind of worldview that so much conservative art either refuses to challenge or outright glorifies. It masks cruelty as order, aestheticizes inequality as tradition, and even when it's not saying anything explicitly political, it still reinforces the idea that the world as it is now, with all its violent hierarchies, is somehow inevitable, maybe even good. As I was getting close to finishing writing this, ICE and the Trump administration began its campaign of fear in LA as it indiscriminately began rounding people up. This isn't just happening in LA, but all over the country, and communities have responded by peacefully protesting, who have been met with the violent escalation of the National Guard being deployed, and then the Marines, and then getting shot at directly by police. I can't talk about conservative art and creativity when life is quite literally imitating art. So I'm not going to be so impartial now. Conservative art gets labeled as all bad or uncreative in the first place because it's a reminder of the values of right-wing conservative ideology, intolerant of tolerance, disdainful of diversity, equity, and inclusion, indignant at the thought of inherited privilege or disadvantage. Conservatism has become more and more extreme every year, more isolationist, more puritanical, overall more retrogressive, all things that disenfranchise millions of people. So why should I be so kind to representations that uphold such a worldview? And why does it seem that the values of left-wing art are unfairly criticized or painted as a pipe dream or somehow a bad thing?
But I think you've made a left-wing work of art. What do you think?
I never think about it that way. It was never, I never do. I don't,
But it's a story, but it's a political story about
do you identify with the empire?
No, I don't. But I don't think that you have to be left-wing to resist authoritarianism, right? But I see the empire as you just described it, right? It's a fascist and authoritarian, and you're meditating on what revolutionary politics looks like in the shadow of that.
If you don't have to be left-wing to resist authoritarianism, then how can you so comfortably label a story about resisting authoritarianism as left-wing? While that logic doesn't hold up, Gilroy's answer, by denying that Andor is a leftist piece of art, feels evasive, as if acknowledging its politics would somehow delegitimize it, despite the fact that all art is political.
I was obsessed with the Russian Revolution, and then the literature on that has expanded over time, and the show trials, and Oliver Cromwell, Zapata, the Roman revolutions. My syllabus for the show it just goes back too far and too deep. It's just something I've always been fascinated in. I don't think of the show as a left-wing show, and I don't want you to think that I came on the show. I sort of said before, I saw the opportunity to use all this material and to dig into all these things, but that is not how I write.
He either views Revolution in a very surface level, underdog story kind of way, or at least understands that to side with authoritarianism is not a good side to be on, but still hesitates to admit what that implies about the politics of the show or him as an individual. The character of Nemec is basically reciting from the Communist Manifesto throughout the first season, so why pretend it's ambiguous or apolitical at all? Especially when you wrote the fictional space commie manifesto he reads from yourself. In his defense, his ambiguity is likely as much personal as it is institutional. In a corporate environment like Disney's, being overtly leftist could piss off people who write his checks and some of the Star Wars audience who, Jesus Christ, not the most understanding group of people on the planet. That doesn't excuse the denial, but it at least helps explain it while simultaneously highlighting why it's important that people in Gilroy's position not beat around the bush. Would he be questioned about the show's politics had it been the acolyte he wrote? Probably fucking not. It's a crazy thing to say because of the direct reflection of real-world events happening outside some of the same offices where Andor was in some part created. Many of the same people who worked on the show or praised it are probably some of the same ones saying, right now, violence is unacceptable as they watch cavalry police trample protesters and target and shoot the press. Who exactly is doing the violence here? I wonder? And I don't give a fuck about a few charred Waymos. What I care about are people being ripped from their families and children being blown to bits with bombs paid for with our tax dollars. It's myopic and brain dead for Gilroy to say he doesn't write with political intention or think about it that way. It's the most lived up loser ass take I've heard in a while. It is left wing, and that's not a bad thing. The fact that this still feels like something dangerous to admit speaks to how thoroughly the Overton window has shifted and how stigmatized any leftist thought is, and thus leftist art. You don't really see that with right-wing art. Sure, it gets derided online or mocked for being kitschy, but it's not stigmatized in the same way because conservative messaging, even when it's extreme, still aligns with capitalist liberal sensibilities. It tells audiences that the system works, and that if it doesn't work for you, the answer isn't revolution, it's personal responsibility. Just pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you lazy, complaining piece of shit. If you don't love it, leave it! Resisting injustice and questioning authoritarian power are often dismissed as political only when they challenge the status quo, which is the whole point. Protest, but as long as it's not disruptive or an inconvenience to me. Where left-wing art tells the story of the oppressed, conservative art, more often than not, tells the story of the oppressor, or mourns a world where the oppressor is no longer allowed to crush rebellion with impunity. And while both kinds of art can be technically beautiful or emotionally affecting, only one of them has a reason to ask for positive change for everyone. Art isn't neutral. It never has been. It reflects the world it was made in, so if the world feels cruel and unequal and rigged against the majority of its citizens, which historically it always has been, then the art that speaks most truthfully about it will probably seem left-wing because it demands values such as dignity, equity, and liberation. It shouldn't be something artists or critics are afraid to admit and stand up for. Sure, conservatives purport to also value those things, but their actions often prove the opposite, and it doesn't matter what you say if you're a big fat fucking liar in the end.
There is no empirical way to determine whether a piece of art is objectively good or truly bad. There will always be someone who likes even the shittiest art. That being said, for every prosaic watercolor made by Hitler, there's a revolutionary mural by Diego Rivera. For every direct-to-video God's Not Dead sequel, there's Brazil, and They Live, and Sorry to Bother You, and A Bug's Life. For every piece of right-wing art, there is left-wing art that presents empathetic, progressive ideas, even when its execution is dog shit, or its creator denies its political motivation. Once it enters the public sphere, its meaning is as much determined by the audience as it is by the creator. But all the conservative art that I've talked about, even the stuff that seems innocuous, exists in spite of a reality that so desperately yearns for community over individualism, empathy over apathy. But it often clings to some idealized static utopia that never existed and isn't in line with the mood of the people, which is why so much of it sucks. Sure, we can appreciate conservative creativity in art for its high-level technique and application, but if so much of it asks nothing of itself, or the audience, or the creator, then what's the point beyond being a bumper sticker or a call for everything to just stay the same? Is that really the world we want to immortalize in our paintings and literature and cinema? I get that people can change, that conservatives can change, but it's often too little, too late, and at the cost of liberty, truth, and justice.